This is Dr. Joseph from Hope for Today Outreach. Today we embark on a new series which I have entitled God the Poor in Social Justice. In Galatians 2 verse 10, Apostle Paul wrote, "They only asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I also was eager to do." The admonition, remember the poor, is a central focus in Pauline theology and Paul's own understanding of the ethical and practical dimensions of Jesus' teaching and social preaching. This important phrase is first mentioned in Galatians 2 verse 10 as Paul enunciates, "They only ask us to remember the poor, the very thing I also was eager to do." Now, this particular Galatian text alludes to Paul's collection activity in the Jewish diaspora on behalf of the miserably poor, tokoi in Greek, among the Christians in Jerusalem. The historical context was the devastated famine mentioned in Acts chapter 11 verse 27 and 28. So the majority members of the Jerusalem early church community were between absolutely poor and relatively poor. Christians in the early church movement came reasonably from the lower stratum groups. They were probably not property owners and could afford only the minimum existence. So the abandonment of socio-economic ties by Jesus and his followers, as well as post-resurrection Christian communities, meant participation in the fate of the poor in Jewish and Greco-Roman society, and thus dependency on external support. Now, what I try to do in the first part of this series is to define what we mean by social justice, and what, since the noun poor is closely connected with poverty, and we will share with you some research, some studies about global poverty and poverty in the United States as well. But our main goal is to find out from the Old Testament, what is God's attitude towards the poor? What is God's attitude towards social justice? First, let us begin with some definition. Let's begin with social justice. What do we mean by social justice? How do we define this important expression? Well, I am indebted to Matthew Robinson in an article he has written, "What is Social Justice?" First, social justice is defined as the opportunity to promote a just society by challenging injustice and valuing diversity. So according to Robinson, it exists when all people share a common humanity and therefore have a right to equitable treatment, support for their human rights, and fair allocation of community resources. But however, the social justice has also been defined by two prominent thinkers, political scientists, and I would like to share what they think about social justice. Now, we begin with John Rawls in 2003, Justice as Fairness, and David Miller's book, Principles of Social Justice. So according to Rawls, social justice is about assuring the protection of equal access to liberties, rights, and opportunities, as well as taking care of the least advantaged members of society. Thus, whether something is just or unjust depends on whether it promotes or hinders equality or access to civil liberties, human rights, opportunities, and so forth. Miller and Principles of Social Justice define social justice as a virtue that pertains to what you are due or owed, as well as what you owe others. It requires that everyone agrees to treat others as equals in a manner that is not egocentric or selfish. This does not mean, however, that everyone has to agree on all procedures to bring about justice, for people generally agree on what justice demands. This is what he calls the stability of justice. Now, the next topic we want to define for you is the global poverty. Global poverty, since global poverty is closely related to the poor, the victim of global poverty, I want to bring your attention to World Bank, a recent research that was done by World Bank. Let me share some data with you from this report. Now, according to World Bank, global poverty has declined significantly over the last few decades. The number of people living on less than $1.25 a day has halved since 1990, reaching around 1 billion people in 2011. So we still have 1 billion people living in poverty, and as of 2011. So that represents 14.5% of the entire global population. So the $1.25 the $1.25 a day poverty line in 2005 prices and represent the average of national poverty lines of the 15 poorest developing countries. It's interesting, some of those countries that include India, where the poverty rate is 30%. Congo is very high. Nigeria is 40%, and then Pakistan is way high. Now I want to share another research from World Bank to help us understand the subject matter. As far as the global poverty, in 2008, and I'm just reading, 2008, the estimated world population was 6.55 billion people. Over 5 billion people lived in the developing world. Nearly half, almost 3 billion people, lived in moderate poverty, or less than $2 per day. Globally, over 1 billion people live in extreme or absolute poverty, that is on less than $1, that's US money, a day. Extreme poverty only occurs in countries in the third world. Those living in extreme poverty cannot meet their basic survival needs, include food, water, shelter, health care. Those living in moderate poverty, however, have their basic needs met, but just barely. Relative poverty is experienced when people's basic needs are met, but these individuals lack access to resources and upward mobility. Now, poverty in itself, according to Social Justice Handbook by McKinnon, is primarily an economic issue. Economics raise many questions about social justice and people's access to capital, resources, and wealth. Wealth is not equally dispersed around the world. Parts of the world, however, are overflowing with the poorest of the poor. And other parts of the world have concentrated wealth. For example, there are 380.6 million people in India who live on less than $1 per day. 1/3 of India's population live in extreme poverty. The United States, for example, and in a book called The Rich and the Rest of Us by Tavis Smiley and Cornel West, this is what they tell us from their research, the conclusion they have drawn from their research. This is from the United States now. They write, while the incomes of the richest 1% of Americans, those earning $380,000 or more, have grown by 33% over the past 20 years. The income growth for the other 90% of Americans, including the middle class, has been at a retro standstill. Today, an American in the top 1% takes an average $1.3 million per year, while the average American earns just $33,000 per year. And they continue by noting the number of people living in poverty rose by 2.6 million between 2009 and 2010. Revised census number released in 2011 revealed that the number of Americans living in poverty was closer to 50 million. In the Census Bureau's history of tracking poverty statistics, the Great Recession marked the fourth period of consecutive annual increase in 52 years. So this is astounding, guys. But the question for us today, what does the Bible say about the poor? What is God's attitude towards poverty, towards the poor, towards social justice, social inequality? So we want to turn to the very first part of the Bible, the Old Testament. I'm going to share with you some important text that will clarify, that will shed great understanding on God, about God's attitude towards the poor and the problem of social inequality. And the implications are, what shall the church do to eradicate, to alleviate poverty in our midst, in our communities, in our state, and our country, in the world at large? We have a huge responsibility. In fact, Christians are called to give sacrificially, to care for the poor. This is not a responsibility of the government. It's an imperative from the Bible. We begin in various passages in the Psalms. For example, the psalmist presents God as the champion of the poor. For example, in Psalm 9:18, Psalm 9:18 reads, God as the champion of the poor. For the needy will not always be forgotten, nor the hope of the afflicted perish forever. This is the psalmist praying to God, say, God, you will not forget the poor, people who are in need. You will give them hope. You will give hope to the afflicted. They will not die in poverty. So again, Psalm 10:14, verse 14 says, "You have seen it, for you have beheld mischief and vexation to take it into your hand. The unfortunate commits himself to you." The word unfortunate could be translated as the poor, the oppressed, the needy. You have been the helper of the orphan. This is God. God has been on the side of the unfortunate and the orphans, the widows. And other verses include Psalm 12, verse 5, 14, 6, 22, 24, 46. For example, in Psalm 146, verses 7, 8, and 9, the psalmist is persuaded that God's care for the poor is explicit, and his commitment to social justice and equality on behalf of the poor, the oppressed, the widows, the orphan is limitless. The psalmist says God is the one who executes justice for the oppressed, who gives food to the hungry. The Lord sets the prisoner free. The Lord lifts up those who are bowed down. The Lord loves the righteous. The Lord watches over the sojourner. Now, the word sojourner here can be translated as the immigrant, the alien. He upholds the widow and the fatherless. Now, again, this psalm describes God's attitude towards the poor. The psalmist is convinced that God despises those who oppress the poor. Divine help is promised to the most vulnerable and oppressed in society. For example, in Deuteronomy 24, verse 14 and 15, it is read, "You shall not oppress a hired servant who is poor and needy." The word servant here could be translated as a slave. So a person who was a slave, not only was a slave, but he was poor and needy. God prohibits the mistreatment of such people. So the verse continues, "Whether is one of your brothers or one of the sojourners, immigrants who are in your land within your towns, you shall give him his wages on the same day before the sun set, for he is poor and counts on it. Lest they cry against you to the Lord and you be guilty of sin." So the imperative was for the people of God, especially those who were managers, who owned vast number of lands, property owners. They shall pay the poor on time. They shall not rob them of their salary, of their wages. You shall give them what's due to them. So God is very concerned about social and economic justice issues, and therefore warns his people to treat the poor and the oppressed with dignity and fairness. In this passage, God sides himself with the poor by defending them against possible oppressors. Now you may ask, well, doesn't God care about the wealthy, the rich? Well, that's a good question. The Bible does say God cares about all people, but God gives preferential treatment to the poor. From the book of Genesis all the way to Revelation, we see God is portrayed, God is depicted as always on the side of the oppressed and the poor. Now, a writer by the name of Zora states that a presumption of divine empathy toward an affinity with the poor is expressed in God's commandment in one of the earliest biblical sections, the so-called Book of the Covenant. Again, this is it in Exodus 22, verse 22 and 25. This is what God's heart reveals to us. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn. If you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be like a money lender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. Now, let's pause for a minute. Really, is this in the Bible? Here it is. God says, when someone mistreats the poor, He will punish that person. He will execute divine judgment. He also says to His people, and the implication is for us today, not to charge the poor the unfortunate interest when you lend them money. This is in the Bible. If you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be like a money lender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. In other words, to lend money to the poor and to add interest on top of that is a miscarriage of justice. It violates the very principle of divine justice. How could you charge interest on the money, on the sum you lent to a poor? The person is poor. That's the idea here. Bruce, another writer by the name of Bruce Malkov, states that there is a development of concern for justice to the oppressed, even in the so-called the Holiness Code. The reference here is the book of Leviticus. The Holiness Code began in chapter 17 all the way to chapter 26. Even in the book of Tobit, one of the books Christians do not embrace, but the idea of justice, effective caring for the poor, is celebrated. In the book of Tobit, we are told, do not turn your face away from anyone who is poor, and the face of God will not be turned away from you. For almsgiving delivers from death and keeps you from going in the darkness. Indeed, almsgiving for all who practice it is an excellent offering in the presence of the Most High. So Tobit is saying, look, if anyone who is poor, do not turn away a gesture of compassion, an act of generosity. Do not cease to show acts of kindness given to the poor, because once you do that, it will bring pleasure to God. For example, the Essene community in the Second Temple period, or what's called Second Temple Judaism, who inhabited the Dead Sea region, expressed a radical perspective towards the dominated, the old, and new Jewish upper classes who pursued after riches at the exploitation of the poor and lower classes. Now, this is very important because it shows, it reveals the attitude of God's people towards social justice. It also reveals their understanding of God's precepts about social justice. Now, another book I want to bring your attention to is Ben Sira, or Ben Sira as other people say it. Now, the author rejects this self-incurred poverty. For him, self-incurred poverty is hateful and shameful to anybody. Because some people would say, look, the Bible calls us to be poor in spirit, right? This is not what we're talking about. We're talking about material poverty. So the same writer warns of the dangers of acquiring a lot of wealth unjustly. And he admonishes the rich to cultivate a merciful social attitude towards the poor and the oppressed, which corresponds with the will of God. Two important texts are in view here. Chapter 5 verse 1, it says, "Do not set your heart on your wealth, nor say I can acquire it." Now, the importance of this verse means this writer, this text was significantly influenced by divine theory of justice and generosity towards the poor. Chapter 4 verse 1 says, "My son, deprive not the poor of his living, and do not put desperate eyes to shame." So the divide between the poor and the rich is substantially right. And the metaphorical rhetoric describing the relationship between the two is radically striking. Let me read something to you here. "What fellowship has a wolf with a lamb? No more has a sinner with a godly man. What peace is there between a hyena and a dog? And what peace between a rich man and a poor? Wild asses in the wilderness are the prey of lions. Likewise, the poor are the pastures for the rich." Now, the mistreatment of the poor and the oppressed is an important discourse in the social criticism and prophetic tradition of Judaism, which we shared with you. It is a grave moral injustice in the Hebrew Bible and against divine law. God will vindicate the cause of the poor and the oppressed. The oppressed will not go unpunished, the Bible states. The poor can expect divine support and compassion because God's solidarity with them is unwavering. Nicholas Walter Storff states that Israel's religion, that means Judaism, was a religion of salvation, not of contemplation. That is what accounts for the mantra of the widow. the orphans, the aliens, and the poor. Not a religion of salvation from this earthly existence, but a religion of salvation from injustice of this earthly existence, he states. So hence, it is only correct for the God of Israel to reason in Deuteronomy 15, verse 4. For there will be no poor among you. Therefore, I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy and the poor in your land. These sets of divine commands clearly prohibit oppressive actions towards the oppressed, the needy, and the poor. They reveal Yahweh's high ethical sensibility, and not only providing total justice for people easily misused, the sojourner, the widow, and the fatherless, the poor and the oppressed, but also in calling for equality, social equality, in economic equality, with and love towards them. So the best way we can express love towards the poor, the orphan, the widow, the needy, the fatherless, is to do acts of compassion and social justice. So the imperative is an urgent appeal to practice social justice and equality. It is also a clarion call for positive deeds towards the deprived and this social group of individuals, which we just mentioned. So God's solidarity with the oppressed stands out in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Is decisive liberative commitment to defending, liberating, and preserving the poor, the oppressed, as well as fighting their oppressors, is unreserved, because they are helplessly exploited in society and vulnerable. The poor and the needy are dependent solely and completely upon God for help, since they could look nowhere else. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, God is the source of all justice. God is actively committed to the happiness of everyone, the integral liberation of the oppressed, and the release of all prisoners. Now, it is important to state that the call to social justice, to social equality, for Christians to exercise compassion towards the poor, is not only a divine imperative, it's also a practice. It was practiced by the early church in the first century. In fact, God's call to practice social justice, to care for the poor, is based on 5 biblical principles and mandates that reflect God's character and his active participation in the human drama, which is the overarching message of the Bible. God's heart for social justice is linked to God's righteousness. As we noted in Psalm 146, verse 7, 8, and 9, God upholds the cause of the oppressed, and He gives food to the hungry. The Lord sets prisoners free. The Lord gives sight to the blind. The Lord lifts up those who are bowed down. The Lord loves the righteous. The Lord watches over the foreigner and sustains the fatherless and the widow. But He frustrates the ways of the wicked. How does He do that? He does it through us. He does it through me and you. Your wealth, your property, everything you have belongs to the Lord. It's not your own. It's not mine. So we are called to share. You all say, Dr. Joseph, you're preaching socialism. Well, if you think I'm preaching socialism, I think God was the first socialist, or He's the first socialist, because He's the one who has given us those commands, those imperatives to care for the poor. In Isaiah 58, verse 10 and verse 11, we are called to care for the hungry and the afflicted is a public demonstration of living out the justice of God. This is God speaking to the prophet Isaiah, to His people. God states, if you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness, and your gloom be like the noonday. The Lord, this is the promise for those of us who care for the poor. The Lord will guide you always. That is divine blessing. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land, and He will strengthen your faith. Not only God will guide you, the sense of guidance here implies protection, divine safety, but also you will have no needs. God will satisfy all your needs in Christ Jesus. A third promise is that God will spread your fame. He will tell people about your goodness. In Matthew 25, verses 35 and 36. In fact, Jesus Himself, caring for the poor, is intrinsic to Jesus's ministry, Jesus's own relationship to the poor. When Jesus was on earth, guess with whom He hangs out? With the poor, the tax collectors, the oppressed, the prostitutes, people in the lower class. In fact, in Matthew 25 we just cited, and Jesus states, "For I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. And I was in prison, and you came to me." This passage is critical for many reasons. First, all the verbs are in past tense. And this passage relates to or forecasts divine judgment on the last day, when Jesus will interrogate His followers. I was hungry, past tense, gave, was, welcomed, naked, clothed, was visited, was came. That means Christians ought to give food to the hungry, provide drink to those who are thirsty, and to exercise an attitude of hospitality to strangers. Strangers here could be another word for immigrants, for the aliens, undocumented workers living in your neighborhood. You don't call police for them. You care for them. You don't call police to have their family deported to their native land, but you provide shelter for them. And the imperative also is to visit those who are hospital bound, nursing home bound, those who are in prison should not be neglected. This is a huge ministry. This is what salvation looks like for Jesus. This is the gospel. The gospel is very practical. This is genuine theology. That's the theology that saves. Theology that reaches out to the poor. Theology that transforms communities, transforms society. That's the theology that changes a nation. Care for the poor is also a fundamental Christian practice, as we mentioned, in a public demonstration of the love of Christ. When Jesus was preaching, healing the sick, John the Baptizer, or John the Baptist, wanted to make sure whether Jesus was the Messiah promised in the Hebrew Scriptures. So John sent his disciple to Jesus, because John wanted to verify the work of Jesus, his messianic stamp, by the work he does, he performs. Because the Bible says the Messiah would be a man of the people, of the poor. So Jesus, who knew those passages about the Messiah, confirmed to John that he was fulfilling the expectations of the Jewish Messiah. So the Messiah was supposed to do what? Listen to Jesus. Luke 7 verse 22. Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight. The lame walk. Lepers are cleansed. And the deaf hear. The dead are raised up. The poor have good news preached to them. That's what the Messiah was supposed to do. To care for the poor. And the people of the Messiah, the followers of the Messiah, ought to follow his suit, his example, his pattern. This is what Christianity is about. Faith in action, as James 2:14, 15, 16, 17 states. What good is it, dear brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith but don't show it by your actions? Can that kind of faith save anyone? Suppose you see a brother or sister who has no food or clothing, and you say goodbye and have a good day. Stay warm and eat well. But then you don't give that person any food or clothing. What good news that what good does that do? So you see, faith by itself isn't enough unless it produces good deeds. It is dead and useless faith. This is James. James tried to reconcile spiritual salvation with material salvation, or the social aspect of the gospel. As you see, the followers of Jesus never divorce the gospel from its social imperative, from its social aspect. It's all over in the Bible. It's in the Gospels. It's in Paul. This is a pattern that is set in the Old Testament. I hope the Lord will use this passage not only to convince your heart, to move your spirit, but to transform your community, your church, to take the gospel seriously, to take social outreach seriously. This is the heart of God. This is the heart of God. This is what true theology looks like. Theology that saves. We are called to teach a theology that transforms the mind and the heart, and change our community and make a difference in the lives of people. The Bible doesn't even address the issue that people are poor because they're lazy. In fact, as Christians, we should not even ask that question. We have a responsibility to care for the poor, to reach out to the poor, to the needy, to the orphans. These people are often neglected, undermined, jettisoned, cast aside in our churches, in our communities. Lord, we thank you for allowing us to share your word with your people. We pray, Father, that you will move in our hearts and our spirit, to soften our hearts, Father, to nurture an attitude of grace, an attitude of hospitality, an attitude of giving, sacrificial giving, an attitude of kindness, generosity towards those who are in need, those who are poor, the orphans, the widow, the immigrants, those who have been cast aside, Father, in society. We know you care for them because you created these people according to your image and likeness. In Jesus' name. Again, this is Dr. Joseph from Hope for Today Outreach. May the Lord richly bless you.